Introduction to Paul Cardan, The Meaning of Socialism by Maurice Brinton, Paul Cardan being the pen name of Cornelius Castoriadis. The following text originally appeared in a somewhat different form in the spring 1961 issue of International Socialism. It was written by Paul Cardan, one of the editors of the French magazine Socialism au Barbarie. A fundamental restatement on the objectives of the socialist movement is, we believe, imperative. The quote left, end quote, today is not noted for the originality of its thought, the intelligibility of its message, or for its mass appeal. Its main features are in fact its conservatism, its antiquated, almost ritualistic jargon, and its utter isolation. Its adherents, quote, whistle in the dark, end quote. Followers are consoled with assurances that the stagnant years are only temporary. The capitalist crisis will sooner or later descend upon us. The day of the sex will then arrive. Meanwhile, influence wanes. Circulation of papers and magazines dwindles. The jargon becomes more rarefied, more obscure, and more irrelevant. Few have the temerity to challenge the hallowed concepts. Those who do are quickly excluded as pariahs or, quote, agents of the counter-revolution, end quote, or they are accused of, quote, throwing away the baby with the bathwater, end quote. But what is it really that is going down the drain? Is it a viable infant, or is it some putrefying abortion that has been poisoning the water for several decades? "44 years after the Russian Revolution and 16 years after World War II, the infallible dogmas of yesterday still serve as good coin. The fact that people display an ever-increasing indifference is scarcely noticed by the self-appointed repositories of, quote, revolutionary, end quote, rust. The decay of the, quote, Marxist, end quote, left is due, we believe, to its refusal to recognize the new reality. We are reminded of some of the leaders of the Paris Commune of 1871 who tragically attempted to garb the essentially proletarian movement in the phrases of the petty bourgeois radicals of 1793. The crises and contradictions of exploiting society have not lessened. They express themselves, however, in forms that differ from views accepted in the, quote, classical left. The standard of living of the working class is not worsened under capitalism. In this respect, John Strachey is right, and the, quote, orthodox, end quote, Marxists wrong. But other, more important changes have taken place. Proletarianization has proceeded relentlessly. Thousands of jobs and professions, formerly requiring skill and training and offering their occupants status and satisfaction, have today been stripped of their specialized nature. Not only have they been reduced to the tedium and monotonous grind of any factory job, but their operatives have been degraded to simple executors of orders, as alienated in their work as any bench hand. Marxists would be better employed analyzing the implications of this important change in the social structure, rather than waving their antiquated economic slide rules at Strachey. Both the ruling and the working classes have amassed a whole new historical experience. It is ludicrous to assume that only the proletariat is capable of learning. The wholesale nationalization of the means of production in Russia and increasing state intervention in economic affairs in the West have shown that the abolition of private ownership and state planning do not of themselves lessen exploitation or bring socialism any nearer. Such measures may in fact strengthen the grip of the rulers and save their economies from the recurrent slumps which were once such a common feature of capitalism. They are accepted by, quote, progressive, end quote, capitalism and bureaucracy alike. All this necessitates a complete change in emphasis in socialist propaganda. Precisely what we mean is well illustrated in Cardan's work. A number of urgent questions confront us. What is the nature of exploitation in the contemporary world? How do people struggle against exploitation in the contemporary world? How do they show their alternative to the present society? How will people build the new society? Cardan's article does not provide all the answers to these questions. No blueprint ever will, of course, but it boldly sweeps aside the accumulated theoretical cobwebs of a generation. It attempts to discuss real problems and avoids the fruitless and endless arguments about interpretations of socialist holy writ. In our opinion, this is reason enough why it should be widely read. Solidarity Pamphlet 6, September 1961. Preface to Paul Cardan, The Meaning of Socialism, by Maurice Brinton, Paul Cardan being a pseudonym for Cornelius Castoriadis. In September 1961, Solidarity first published this text in pamphlet form. Several hundred copies were sold within a few weeks. In the course of the last 4 years, we have had to reprint on 4 occasions, and the total number of copies, out, end quote, is now nearly 2,000. The sustained interest in and demand for this pamphlet has encouraged us to reprint yet again, this time on a much larger scale. The slow disintegration of traditional socialist ideology has produced an enormous theoretical vacuum. The ideas outlined in this pamphlet are a contribution, however small, to filling this void. The return of a labor government now seeking, quote, efficiently, end quote, to administer capitalist society in the interest of those who own the means of production and manage the productive machine, the collapse of the young socialist movement, the best illustration to date of the, quote, participation exclusion, end quote, dilemma confronting the bureaucratic organizations in their relations with, quote, their, end quote, members. The increasing campaign jointly waged by management and the trade union bureaucracies against, quote, unofficial, end quote, action in industry. The, quote, betrayal, end quote, of layer after layer of reformist, Stalinist, or Trotskyist-supported, quote, leaders, end quote, all highlight the need for a basic restatement of socialist objectives and for a rethinking of socialist strategy and methods of action. The pamphlet is not a blueprint for a socialist society. The content and form of such a society will be determined by the masses themselves, in struggle and not through theoretical speculation by even the most, quote, revolutionary, end quote, of revolutionary theoreticians. We hope, however, that the pamphlet will play its part in the development of the consciousness necessary for this gigantic task of social transformation. The pamphlet is aimed primarily at those breaking with the organizations of the, quote, traditional, end quote, left. We think it will provide them with a whole new system of ideas with which to analyze, comprehend, and challenge the all-pervasive bureaucratic society around them. It argues in terms of which they will be familiar. It will, we hope, assist them to purge themselves of the hangover of, quote, traditional, end quote, ideas and concepts which are almost inevitably carried over following a sudden organizational break with a traditional organization, whether reformist or Bolshevik. We are confident that these ideas, denounced as, quote, premature, end quote, utopian, end quote, and, quote, sectarian, end quote, when they were first published, will continue to make headway in the months and years to come. The fact that they correspond to today's reality and that they are seen to correspond to it is the best guarantee of their ultimate success. Solidarity Pamphlet 6, 2nd edition, November 1965.